World building. This can be a topic that can be intimidating, whether you're a newer gamer or an older gamer. No matter what the genre for your RPG, world building can be something that could be a bit overwhelming at times. Sometimes people avoid world building and they go stick with the published source stuff, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I feel like world building is something that can differentiate you from everybody else who's playing a given game. For this video, I'm going to focus on D&D or fantasy-based genres, but really this information can apply to any genre of game. Post-apocalyptic, sci-fi, whatever, doesn't matter. World building is something that you can think about on two levels, a macro level or a micro level. Now, what I do is I think about things on both levels. Build. How, in fact, do you build? So my response is this. For my original home world that I've been creating for almost 20 years, I started off with a macro approach. I thought about the universe. I thought about the divine, the deities, the gods. I thought about how I wanted alignment to work. I created 13 divinities. These are concepts related to the divine. Some of them stand by themselves, some of them intermingle. My pantheons, and there are many pantheons, all kind of tie into these divinities, right? So I thought about things that we have in our own world for inspiration. I thought about the divine within seasons, right? So you have spring, summer, fall, and winter. I thought about the divine in the elements, earth, wind, fire, and water. I thought about the divine between law and order, or chaos and entropy, perhaps. I thought about the divine within good, neutrality, and evil. I thought about the life cycle, right, and how that ties into the seasons. So I thought about all these different things, and then from those things I created gods. I thought about the world that I wanted and some kind of paradigm things, right? Big picture things. So for me, I knew when I was creating this original fantasy setting that I didn't want it to be like all of the other published material. That means no elves, no dwarves, none of the usual races that you'd see in D&D. I wanted my own original races, and more importantly, I wanted to eliminate what I saw as a threat to game worlds as you proceed through them, which is power creep. How do you eliminate power creep? Well, my process for eliminating it was to create within that world and within the storylines of that world a ban on arcane magic. I knew I didn't want arcane magic to be available. I knew I didn't want those spell classes, the arcane spellcasters, to be available. I knew that I didn't want magic items to just be all willy-nilly like something that you could buy in a shop. I knew that I wanted that because I wanted to make a challenging world that forced the players to think about what they were doing and not just rely on spells and magic items to get them through tougher encounters. But on the flip side, because I had spent all that time in the macro kind of big picture stuff, developing all of these kind of things related to the divine, I would strengthen my world by making the divine more powerful than it normally is. So access to the divine was greater. The intermediaries for the gods would be more accessible. The actual acts of the gods would be more accessible. So I kind of created a balance. I took away the arcane, but I boosted the divine. Those were all kind of big picture things. And from those, I started to build a world, right? And I knew that I wanted this world, literally the planet where my setting was, to be huge. I wanted it to be much bigger than Earth, like Jupiter big. I wanted continents that would be massive supercontinents and lots of islands and lots of ocean and lots of space to explore, right? I wanted it to be epic, right? The kind of place where you could never run out of adventures and never run out of settings. Not some small place where it could be easily conquered. And I feel like over the last 20 years that has evolved and evolved as I've play tested it with different groups. I found a tremendous amount of success with that. That's my approach to macro. You think of the big concepts, the big rules, the big paradigms that you want in your world or in your game, and you kind of lay those out in your notes and you build from there, and you deduce to smaller level settings and adventures and encounters and other things. It's like the big picture coming down into the smaller stories. Now, on the flip side, you have micro building. So when you're world building on a micro level, you might start off with one place, one village, maybe one little kingdom. And it's part of a continent, but you haven't really developed the rest of that continent yet. So you're focusing on that one little starting place where everybody's going to start off. And you provide just enough information between, factions and NPCs and locations and adventure opportunities, kind of like spokes on a wheel, to get your game going. And then you build it from there. That's more of a micro approach. Now, some of you might be thinking to yourself, Bill, I'm intimidated even by a micro approach. What do I do there? Of course, there are a plethora of tools in the Dungeon Master's Guide and in other game books that help you start to build. But I like to start off with something that may seem odd to people, which is I build a map. So whether you draw it by hand or you're on Photoshop or Paint, whatever you want, maybe you're not sure how to start a world, so make a map. Make one island, make one continent. Just start drawing, put in some mountains, put in some lakes, some rivers, put in a swamp, put in a little desert. When you start to build the geography of that little place, it's kind of like tying micro building in with macro building. You don't necessarily have a big picture idea of what you're building, but you make a land. And from that land, you could populate little areas with it, right? You could come up with caves, you could come up with abandoned mines, old ruined civilizations, castles, catacombs, dungeons. You could come up with a whole society of people who live in the desert and have to struggle to survive every day. And you're like, well, why do they live there? Maybe there's something extraordinarily valuable in the desert that they use to make their living. Maybe it's some ancient spice, like, well, I guess that's a ripoff of Dune, but whatever. I mean, the point is that you could come up with these little ideas, and then you could draw inspiration. I mean, go ahead. You're thinking to yourself, well, I don't want to rip off this or I don't want to rip off that. Everything is a rip off. Everything is. In the end, I'll bet every idea that any of us have ever had is really influenced by something else. And we just take those ideas and put them together in a different way, and that's synthesis. It's creating something new out of a variety of other influences. So whether you want to go big and start off on a macro level and lay out these paradigms, these rules for how your world exists, your universe exists, all that kind of stuff, or you just want to start off small, world building can be very, very exciting and very rewarding. And I feel like when you build your own original world and you change things up, it prevents more experienced players from getting bored. Because when players know everything, when they have all the monsters memorized, when they have all the lore of the Forgotten Realms or whatever setting you use, the published settings, when they know all that stuff already, of course it can be boring, because it's going to be harder for you using those published things to create something new. But the thrill in role-playing games is when your players encounter the unknown. And by encountering the unknown, something that you've made, something that you've changed, something that you've made differently, you're going to reward your players and draw them in and build something truly exciting in an interactive storytelling fashion. So those are my tidbits on world building. And if you're interested in more stuff, if this is a topic that you'd like me to explore more, send me some comments and I'm happy to respond. Until then, go out there and make something cool.
All right, that was a good practice. We weren't recording.
Are you f***ing serious? You better, oh, Karafa, you better be joking.